13 of Give Me Liberty. This chapter is titled A House Divided, and it covers the decades in the 1840s up until the beginning of the Civil War in 1861. So the whole semester, because we already know what happens, we've been seeing this growing divide between the North and the South and the way that they process things, whether that be in business or their social lives. And these are the decades leading up most directly to the Civil War, where these divisions become more stark. So we'll move right in. One calling that you've seen come up over and over again this semester is this idea of manifest destiny. It's this idea that people would be able to expand their settlements. The European Americans would be able to expand their settlements from the East Coast all the way to the West Coast, from Atlantic to Pacific. And this expansion was troublesome because there were already people living in these areas where they were hoping to move. So Native Americans had established bands and tribes and groups, and the European Americans started to move into this. We've been talking about this the whole semester. And at this point, we talked about the movement and the expulsion of Native Americans further and further west or into reservation land. And this opened up land for people to settle. In the Depression of 1837, people began looking at the West as this potential for a new life, a potential to remake themselves, economically speaking. So more and more people started to be interested in moving west. And we also talked about the improvements in transportation and communication as being a reason for that as well. People started to move west using the Oregon Trail because Oregon was particularly said to be fertile and open for farming. If you've ever played the game, I may be dating myself at this point, but it used to be big, huge green pixels on a floppy disk. If you did play it, most of you probably played it in a color version and don't know what a floppy disk is. However, it's not quite like the game, but some things are the same. Lots of people died of disease on the way out, and it was difficult to find food. By 1860, so right before the Civil War, there were about 300,000 people who had moved to the West Coast, who had come from Europe initially or were European American heritage. And settling the West became sort of a goal for people. And the idea was that there were places to farm, places to mine, and eventually places to do business via the Pacific Ocean. Many people also added another level to manifest destiny, in that they believed that God had ordained this land to be settled by them. Particularly, it was said the Mormons had this idea that Jesus would return to what is now the United States. So people had different religious ideas on top of having the more economically centered ideas. Mexico at this point is not what we think of Mexico today. So New Mexico, California, and Texas were part of Mexico. And they were far outposts, so they didn't necessarily have a lot of Mexican citizens settled there. And this left them vulnerable to attack by the Americans as they were moving further and further west. New Mexico and California did serve as somewhat of business hubs, even though they were far-flung outposts. They were trading posts between Mexico and the United States. It's just there wasn't much settlement around them. There were a group of people referred to as Californios, and these were Mexican cattle ranchers who had Native Americans and Native Mexicans working for them in these areas. As with all of the cultures that we've talked about, there was a great deal of racism between the Mexicans and the Americans, and also on either side of the border amongst their own citizens. So there were many instances of racial mischaracterization, especially with regard to the natives, both Native Americans and Native Mexicans. And one term that many of these Californios used to use were gente de razón and gente sin razón. And these means people of reason and people without reason, usually referring to people being intelligent enough to become a useful member of society, or people who were meant to be workhorses, essentially. Texas, as part of Mexico initially, it had a large U.S. population even when it was part of Mexico, and people had moved there to farm. And they were supposed to become Mexican citizens when they moved there, but most of them didn't follow through with that. They wanted to remain American citizens, but still farm this land. And in 1830, Mexico annulled these land contracts with Americans and barred American immigration, meaning they didn't want to allow any more Americans to come settle the land because they saw a large population of them coming in and foresaw what could possibly happen in that they might lose Texas to the Americans. Mexico had abolished slavery at this point, and Americans wanted to bring enslaved people with them to expand farming, as they did throughout much of the Deep South, as we've been reiterating. Mexico did not want them to bring enslaved people because it was illegal under Mexican law. Eventually, you can see where this is going, and you obviously know where this is going because Texas is part of the United States. But the Texas independence movement was established, and the Mexican army wanted to impose order on the Texans and reclaim the land, but the rebels wanted independence. So they were trying to claim the land for Texas as its own republic initially. The Alamo is probably the most famous point of contention here. In 1836, Mexican soldiers stormed the Alamo outpost in San Antonio, killing 187 American rebels, and essentially made martyrs out of them by doing this. It's notable. It's a name you probably recognize. Davy Crockett died during this. And the terminology you may have heard before, remember the Alamo, came out, and it was sort of this fighting language, this inspiration for people to continue fighting for independence against Mexico. The Texan fighters got revenge for the Alamo later in San Jacinto, and when they won this battle and captured Santa Anna, who was the president of Mexico as well as the general of the army, this led to their surrender. So the Texans had established their own republic, essentially, at this point. And Sam Houston was the first president of the Republic of Texas. It was a separate republic for a decade before it became part of the United States. The Mexican-American War is sort of this Texan independence movement en masse. So this is a much larger war. The United States asked to purchase California. They wanted this manifest destiny to go from the East Coast to the West Coast, and they were denied this purchase, And by 1846, they were ready to actually fight for it. They were ready to have a land grab war. And President Polk approved this. So in April 1846, U.S. troops moved into the borderlands between Texas and Mexico, and fighting broke out, which led to a declaration of war. This expansionist idea, this manifest destiny, this story of the United States going from sea to shining sea, helped gin up support for the war. And the idea was that this land would eventually be filled in by settlers. So they would spread out, there would be more farming, and it would reach from ocean to ocean. The North had some fears that this would lead to the expansion of slavery into the newly integrated territory. So if they were to take this property from Mexico, they were concerned that a place where slavery had been illegal would then be turned over to a place where slavery was legal. Henry David Thoreau was notably jailed for refusing to pay taxes in protest of the war. So when you pay taxes, you are contributing to the Department of Defense even today. So many people didn't want to pay their taxes because they didn't want to support a war that was strictly over land. And Henry David Thoreau is a household name, so it's notable that he did this and people were talking about it. Soon-to-be President Abraham Lincoln also opposed the war because he thought that the president had too much power if they were allowed to demand an attack on their own. So if you establish a state of emergency, the presidency has much more power, and they're able to do more drastic things on demand, like go to war. Typically, you need approval from Congress to do that, but there are situations in which there are some loopholes. About 60,000 volunteers enlisted and fought in the Mexican-American War, and there were three separate fronts, or three theaters of war. There was California, which switched hands in 1846 with the intent to eventually incorporate into the United States. There was also Santa Fe and central Mexico. So there were two places, all of these places were technically within Mexico at this point, but when we think of the first two, we now think of the United States and then central Mexico. 1847, the United States took Mexico City. They took control, military control of the city, and it was the first time the United States took a foreign capital under siege. So that is notable on its own. And this led to the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and this was including the annexation of Texas. So Texas was no longer a part of Mexico. California, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, and Utah all went to the United States. The United States paid Mexico $15 million, and the present boundaries that we go by for the United States and for Mexico were drawn. This is a really important word to talk about. It's relatively understudied and under-talked about in classes, but if you really think about it, this increased the size of the United States by 100%, so it doubled it, and it took away half of Mexico's property. So Mexico was much, much larger, and the United States was much, much smaller. And you can see in the bottom picture here, there's this Mexican eagle before the war and the Mexican eagle after the war, and it's meant to draw attention to the fact that Mexico really lost in this deal. this is more talked about on a general basis in history classes in Mexico than it is in the United States. And it's sort of seen as still this really big loss for Mexico. It was half of the land that they had. And wondering how things might have been different. You can see on this map just a bigger picture of what was the United States and what was Mexico. You're familiar with the maps nowadays, so this is just a visual of how different it looked prior to the Mexican-American War. The treaty from the war guaranteed to the males in the new United States territories the same rights, not eights, as American men. So essentially, what they were trying to do was consider Spanish Mexicans, specifically the males, white in the eyes of the law. So they were giving them the same rights as white men. And that was part of the agreement with people who were still living within these areas, even though there were relatively few compared to the rest of Mexico. Native Americans were still considered savage and not given the rights of Americans, even in the lands that were ceded by Mexico. So many groups had more rights under Mexican rule because, first of all, there was very little rule in these outposts, but the laws were also more progressive at the time. And basically, the concept of race included a bunch of different things for people at this point. It included color as a marker, culture, national origin, class, and religion. So all of these different facets of people were sort of lumped in under this race category, and it was more fluid at this time. Mexico had already stated that Spanish, Mexican Indians, and Africans were all equal before the law, but Texas didn't agree, and neither did the rest of the United States. In California, voting and legal rights were only for whites. There were no Asians and no Mexicans allowed to vote or have rights in court. And again, if you were Spanish, you were legally white, or if you were married to a white person, then you could be legally white also. And Native American children were still bought and sold as slaves at this point, and Native Mexican children as well. The Free Soil Party wanted to stop some of what they saw happening in these new territories. They wanted, under the leadership of Martin Van Buren, to keep the new lands free of slavery. It was easier to keep slavery from spreading than it was to get rid of it where it already existed. So that was the strategy that they were still holding on to by not letting new states and new territories use enslaved people to do work. Part of what they were also interested in was providing free homesteads to new settlers in the West, and this was government funded so that people didn't have to have tons of money to be able to move out to the Western lands and start farms. Part of this could help with the population of cities, which was becoming overpopulated quickly, and spread Americans out throughout the territory so that it couldn't be taken back as easily by Mexico. White Southerners saw all of this as denying their rights and as limiting the scope of where slavery could and could not be. So the people who were hoping to move their farms towards the west, who use slave labor, were complaining that they wouldn't be able to move and that their rights were being infringed, and they were essentially stuck where they were and potentially even losing that eventually. So you have people hoping to cut down on the spread of slavery, and you also have people hoping to expand the use of slavery. The Compromise of 1850, we've gone over these sort of compromises before with regard to slavery and free states, and California was admitted as a free state. The slave trade was banned in the capital city of Washington, D.C. This does not mean the slavery itself was banned in Washington, D.C. at this point, but the slave trade was. So you could not buy or sell enslaved people, and they would not be imported from other states and to be divvied out essentially from this point. Slavery in new territories would and should be decided by local popular vote. So the idea is that the people who were moving to a particular territory or who already lived there would decide if the use of enslaved people was what they wanted in this new space. Southerners would be able to reclaim runaway slaves. So this was the idea that if they escaped to a free territory, they would still technically be an enslaved person, and if no one would be required anymore to return them per se, but they would have to go should their owner come find them. And another point within this Compromise of 1850 is that the U.S. paid off the debt that Texas accrued during its independence. So we talked about it being independent for a short time as a republic, but the United States took it on as a new state and paid off the debt that they had accrued on their own. A couple years later, you have the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854, and again, we're outlining slave states, free states, and territories, and slavery determined by popular sovereignty, which is the orange one. New territories that were hoping for statehood suggested that the popular vote should determine the slavery question. So we've established that, but this is being brought up again in 1854. The Whig Party collapsed, and the Democratic Party reigned in the South, which was pro-slavery, and the Republican Party ruled in the North, which was anti-slavery, or at least not willing to expand it into the new territories. So you can see that the names of the parties are similar, and there may still be some underlying ideas that each one holds on to, but likely you'll see stark differences in the behavior of both parties, and you'll be able to parse this out for yourself. But just don't think of these parties in modern terms. Think about them as they're being presented in the time frame. It's at this point where you're really getting close to the Civil War that the lines are becoming more and more clearly drawn, as the states in the North were politically and economically connected, and the same can be said of the South. So there are these cultural differences, there are different economic ideas, there are different methods of labor, there are different ideas about enslavement, and different ideas about what the United States should be, essentially. The Fugitive Slave Act in 1850 stated that federal commissioners would have the ability to determine the fate of fugitives without a jury or court testimony. So this means that if an enslaved person ran away, they could be returned to their owner without having any ability to testify in court for themselves and request their own freedom. this required full cooperation with federal agents, even in free states. So even if someone ran away to a free state, they could be returned to their owner, and whoever may be harboring them was required to cooperate with federal agents. The use of federal power didn't seem to upset the South at this point, which was typically in favor of states' rights. So if they were getting what they saw as their own property back, they were happy to use this federal power. In most other cases, they saw federal power as overreach. Enslaved people were ordered back to their original locations where they were enslaved under this act. What this served to do was not only to return enslaved people back to the farms where they were being enslaved, but it also spurred many people to join the abolition movement, which had already been growing. We talked about that a lot last week and the week before, but it continued to grow, and this treatment of people and this idea that the federal government would decide what should be done in a free state as well as a slave state upset everybody, essentially, just in different ways. And many people were desperate enough not to be returned to enslavement that they used violence against others and themselves to avoid returning to slavery. So many people killed themselves. Some people killed their children with them so that they wouldn't be returned to slavery. And with this federal law dealing with the entire United States, Canada remained an ultimate goal for many people because slavery was illegal in the entire country of Canada, and they were outside the sphere of U.S. influence at that point. So if they could make it to Canada, like one of the letters that you read last week, they would essentially be freed and they couldn't force Canadians to return enslaved people to the United States. As sort of a pick-me-up in the middle here, while it's still complicated, we can also talk about the gold rush, which many people think is quite interesting. In January 1848, gold was discovered at a sawmill in Sierra Nevada mountains, and the population increased dramatically with people interested in the original idea of the European nations, which was wealth in gold. So if you recall all the way back to the beginning of the semester, Spain, England, France, and the Dutch were all interested in seeking gold in what was then the New World. And at this point, they actually found it. And miners from all over the world even flocked to this area. Interestingly, Australia had a gold rush at the same time, but many people were flocking to the United States for many different reasons. And to deal with the mining and to work on the railroad, many Chinese workers had moved to the West Coast and were being essentially rented out to work on both the railroad and in the mines. And most of them were young men with no families, like they often tend to be when there are large groups of people moving around at this time. Women's work in the West at this point was mostly in restaurants or boarding houses, in laundries, and as prostitutes. All of these were relatively lucrative for women, and they had more opportunities than they often had on the East Coast because there were less people, and there were different expectations of behavior. And white miners at this point try to remove non-white miners, and the government actually began to charge foreign miners $20 a month, which caused many people to abandon their pursuits. The reason for this was that non-white miners would often work for lower wages because they had a harder time getting jobs. So Chinese workers and free African American workers were willing to take less pay because it was still more pay than they were able to get other places. There's a short documentary that you'll find on the assignments page for the gold rush, and it's sort of to help you with a visualization of this time frame. Northern politics at the time were centered mostly around the Republican Party. And they were convinced that slavery was a bigger threat to the Union than popery, meaning the invasion of Catholics as they saw it by the Germans and the Irish and the Italians eventually. And it was also a bigger threat than immigration. They were curious to look into the effects of immigration of non-Europeans, and particularly what they saw as non-white Europeans. And the Republicans perceived of themselves as being more morally advanced and more economically advanced than the South. Part of this is also due to the educational opportunities in the North versus the South. So there were many more colleges established throughout the North, colleges and universities. There were more schools in general in the North. To many in the North, the South looked like it was solely made up of slaves, poor whites, and aristocrats. So there were the planter society that we've mentioned before, basically all other whites below them, and then below them, enslaved people. It was not particularly appealing to the northern people who thought that they had a much more egalitarian society and much more opportunity for different people. One of the major goals for the Republicans in the North was ending national support for slavery. So the banning of the slave trade within Washington, D.C.'s borders was a big step for them, even if it didn't necessarily ban the use of slavery. Many were not abolitionists per se. They were trying to strike what they saw as a middle ground, as being against the expansion of slavery into new states, hoping that that would cause it to die out as an institution without having to potentially go to war like they eventually did. One really fun political party name is the Know Nothing Party. They're named the Know Nothings because one was supposed to admit that they knew nothing about it if questioned about the secret society. And that was the precursor to the actual established political party. While their name is fun, they were less fun as people. They harbored nativist sentiments, which meant that they were concerned with keeping European Americans and all others essentially separate. And this didn't even mean all European Americans. They were quite opposed to Catholics, so most of the Germans and the Irish who came to the United States. And they saw themselves as protecting the nation from them because they thought that they were infiltrating the public school system in order to undermine it. So they were going to install all of this popery that we talked about and essentially mislead the future American citizens who were in school at the time. This rising sense of nativism led to electoral wins for populist candidates. Oftentimes when people are afraid that the makeup of their nation is going to change, or if they're afraid that they will be undermined by a different group of people and this xenophobic language is established, they will elect people who they see as an answer to this, as sort of a strong man. And they often promoted this disunion between the people, and we're looking to have these separate societies within America. At the same time, all of this, it's all stacked together in these 2 decades, so it's pretty jam-packed. The Dred Scott case became famous and remains famous up until this point. Dred Scott lived briefly in free states with his owner and sued for freedom based on having lived in a free state where slavery was illegal. We talked about people needing to be returned to slave states, even if they had made it to free states under the Fugitive Slave Act. But this question came up, and there were several questions that came up with regard to this case. So, first question being, are black men citizens who can use the court system? 2, did living in a free state make you free? And 3, could Congress prohibit slavery in the new territories? So these were all of the questions that were built into whatever the court decided about this particular case, because more people would be able to use this as a reference. There was a 6-3 decision against Dred Scott at the Supreme Court level. And what this translated into is that only whites could efficiently use the court system. Living in a free state did not make you a free person, and Congress was not able to dictate the status of slavery in the new states. So those maps that we saw before, where they were free states or slave states and established by popular sovereignty at the point of local government, these are backed up by this decision. What this court case also did was make it clear that the courts were under the control of Southern interests. So there was skewed representation in the government for the South because they were counting enslaved people as part of their population, and they were also counting women as part of their population. And the North was counting women as well, but so the difference comes with counting enslaved people who were not able to vote. Dred Scott was eventually freed by a new master following the decision, but this case established stricter laws. So while he was freed individually, which is fantastic, the laws became stricter around this topic. There's a short PBS documentary that you'll find on the assignments page that will go along with this and explain it in a little more depth. Another famous event at this point is John Brown at Harper's Ferry. So there's an armed assault at Harper's Ferry in Virginia, and there was an attack on the federal arsenal for the abolitionist cause. This was an attempt to end slavery. John Brown had traveled far and wide to find supporters and raise money for the cause of emancipation. So he had gone to many different states and asked for money and asked for people to join him in this violent abolitionism, this militant abolitionism. In 1859, John Brown was one of 21 men, including 5 black men, who seized the arsenal, but they were soon captured or killed by Robert E. Lee and his forces. John Brown survived this initial scuffle, but he was put on trial for treason and sentenced to death. And his death essentially made him a martyr for the cause. There, again, there are difficulties in the legacy of this because many people saw him as a martyr for the cause, and many people also saw him as a violent person. So there are different viewpoints on how this has played out, and there's a short documentary for you to watch about this as well. And you'll hear this come up in pop cultural references as well as popular historical accounts. It's one of the more famous events, and it's quite close to the beginning of the Civil War, so people sort of see all these things as tinder for the fire. Southern nationalism was this feeling that started to arise throughout the South. So the South saw their way of life slipping away and wanted to preserve it. The attack at Harper's Ferry was a particularly eye-opening affair for many people in the South because it was an attack on the basis for their economic and social existence. And it was people willing to become violent in order to defend that. They oftentimes throughout the South resented the North for reaping the benefits of the cotton industry while the South was still falling behind economically. So the South was providing the cotton, they were planting it, they were managing the enslaved people who were picking it, and they were then selling it to the North, who relied on it to make the textiles. So they're intimately connected, but only the North was really progressing economically. Southward expansion was on the table as a solution for creating more space. So more Mexican land and possibly even Central American land were of interest to people in the South. They thought they could expand down if they weren't necessarily allowed to expand west. That would, of course, mean fighting Mexico again to capture more land because slavery, again, was illegal in Mexico. Many in the South continued insisting that slavery should be legal in the new Western territories, and if it didn't become legal, they would attempt to secede. So people started to threaten secession, meaning that they would leave the United States and become their own republics or their own states put together. The election of 1860 has consequences that seem obvious to us now because this determined the presidency for the Civil War. So Lincoln was the nominee for the Republicans, and he won without the support from any southern states. And there was this idea that if people could appeal to the morality for individuals and appeal to keeping the states united as a single country, that they could win this election, and that's what Lincoln relied on. He was also opposed to the Dred Scott decision. So he thought that they had made that ruling incorrectly and that the federal government should be able to say where slavery can and cannot expand into, that they should potentially have a discussion about black men's rights, and if they made it to the North, they shouldn't necessarily have to be returned. And he was also in favor of giving land for free throughout the West and for using government money to help fund the railroads in order to keep expanding westward and having business connections run more smoothly. So they saw this great potential for economic expansion with the railroad, and they thought the government should be helping to establish this if people weren't able to fund it themselves. So this is a map of how the election of 1860 went, and as we mentioned, none of the southern states went for Lincoln. He did get the overwhelming electoral vote, and he had about 500,000 more in the popular vote than did his competitor, and his next largest competitor. And you'll read in the Voices of Freedom book, the Lincoln-Douglas debates. You'll read part of that in there, so you'll be able to see what they were talking about and what they were concerned about. A little bit of background information about Abraham Lincoln is that he was born in 1809, and he began his political career at 21 years of age, so maybe a little bit older than some of you. And he was known for being willing to compromise in order to avoid disunion. So he really didn't want the country to split up. It hadn't been together as one unified nation for very long, and he didn't want to see all of that go to waste. He noted that he was emotionally disturbed by the institution of slavery, but he didn't believe that the nation could or should be split up to accommodate or deny slavery. So he thought that it shouldn't split up, essentially. But he also notes that this division created seeds of disunion, and there would have to be some sort of different compromise than what had come before. He said, "A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free." And with that, the obvious conclusion is that it just can't be this half and half. And one would have to choose slavery or choose freedom for all, and that there couldn't be this middle ground that they'd had going forward, but that the country also shouldn't split up. So it's sort of this idealistic hope that the nation wouldn't split up and they would just be able to establish one mode of operation from the top. He is also a complicated figure, and he wasn't left untouched by the more common racism of his time. He was opposed to the black right to vote. He was opposed to blacks' rights to serve in a jury, and he was noted as favoring sending freed African Americans to Africa. Specifically Liberia, oftentimes, because that was, as we've discussed previously, this little piece of Africa that was sectioned off to send Americans to. And on the other hand, he did note a number of times that he was emotionally moved by the situation of Black Americans. He felt badly for them, even though he didn't necessarily feel that they should have the exact same rights as white people. This brings up a number of questions. How do we judge people who are within their own times? Can we look at other people at the time and see what was possible on a larger scale for people to be talking about? What concepts were people talking about at higher levels, where Lincoln would have most certainly heard equality arguments at this point. So likely he knew about these arguments and disagreed with them. So then if we know that other people had the ability to believe in equality arguments, where does that leave him? Do we allow ourselves to hold people up as important and good in general, even if some of their ideas don't match up with ours? So how much difficult and frankly immoral behavior do you accept from somebody and still allow them to be on the good side of the spectrum between good and bad? Because remember, hardly anybody is just one or the other, and pretty much everybody's mixed. You hope that you fall on the good side of the spectrum. And I mean, it's important to consider this when you're thinking about people who have been idolized throughout history. Why do we idolize people? So oftentimes we idolize the better parts of people because we're hoping that we can hold ourselves to that same standard. And it seems that that's the case with many people for Lincoln, when the reality of the situation is a bit more complicated. The secessionist movement was this movement of the southern states wanting to become what is eventually the Confederate States of America. Lincoln's election signaled a move towards republicanism and a potential end of the way of life in the southern states, with enslavement as being the central focus for the economy and the social standings for people. The Cotton Kingdom seceded. This is 7 states, with South Carolina as the first, and the highest percentage of enslaved people in the population of the state. So they decided to leave in order to preserve slavery as an institution. The language that they were using was really similar to that of the Revolutionary War. There was this appeal to freedom and this appeal to the right to determine the way in which people lived, and this freedom from what they saw as a tyrannical government. The Crittenden Compromise was drawn up at this point in the hopes that it would keep slavery where it was and draw the Missouri Compromise all the way to the Pacific. Turned out it was a little too late, and it essentially didn't work. So the secession took place, and the Confederate States of America was formed. Jefferson Davis was the president of the Confederate States, and they created a constitution that was modeled on that of the United States, but it also guaranteed slavery as a right. The vice president said that it is the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to superior race, is his natural and normal condition. So racism was embedded within the secession movement and within the establishment of the Confederate States of America. It's popular sometimes to say that it was not, but it most certainly is, and that's a direct quote from the Vice President of the Confederate States. There are obviously more elements that go into it, but this is indeed one of them. This left people concerned about what to do. Many even within the South were opposed to this secession movement. They didn't want to split off from the United States. And Lincoln was hopeful that the secessionist movement would collapse and that there would be no need to go to war. And he's quoted as saying, "In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war." So he was acknowledging that he wanted to keep the Union together, and that if they continued with their secession rather than attempting to compromise, they would evoke civil war. So one of the questions is, it's obviously easier for us to think about it now that we know what happened, but how do you know when something is going to turn so violent and unruly? We can see patterns that lead up to particularly violent situations, and that's part of why we study history, is so that we can identify these patterns and potentially fix something before it goes wrong. but it can sometimes also be wrong. And in that case, is preemptive attack okay? There is a possibility that the thing that the pattern is identifying does not come to be. And in that case, would the attack have been justified? But there's no way to know. So these are more philosophical questions, obviously not anything that we're going to answer this semester, and likely may never be able to answer in our own lifetimes, or so long as humans exist. Much larger questions, but definitely things to think about while you're reading about this. What happens is the Civil War begins. Next week we're going to go over the Civil War in more detail, but this beginning of it is April 12th, 1861, is this Fort Sumter, South Carolina location where the first shots were fired of the American Civil War. So much like Lexington and Concord are noted as the first shots of the Revolutionary War, this is noted as the beginning of the Civil War, even though there had been violent interactions leading up to this. So it's again these chosen boundaries of war, if you will, by creating a start date and creating an end date. The first shots were fired by the South because they saw the Northern presence at the fort as an intrusion of their sovereignty as a nation. Remember, they're the separate Confederate States of America at this point. On April 14th, the United States troops surrendered to the Confederate troops here. April 15th, Lincoln sent 75,000 U.S. troops to suppress the rebellion and violence. So sending more people just days after the first shots. And he's quoted as saying, both sides deprecated war. By one of them, but one of them would make war rather than let the nation survive. And the other would accept war rather than let it perish. And the war came. So what that means is one would go to war to back up the secessionist movement and back up the creation of the Confederate States so that the expansion of slavery could continue. And the other, being the North, would accept war and fight it rather than let the nation split up. So in your Voices of Freedom book, you will read A Protest Against Anti-Chinese Prejudice. You will read A Resistance to Civil Government, and you'll also read an excerpt from the Lincoln-Douglas debates. So you have more philosophical ideas and political ideas to read about this week. And then next week, we'll be talking about the Civil War and about Reconstruction. Next week is actually the last week of the semester, so you'll be doing both Chapter 14 and Chapter 15. So I'll send out a reminder email to let everyone know, and they'll all be posted at the same time. And I'll also post the final for you to look at ahead of time and spend time on, and we'll have an email sent out about that as